Now we have quarter sections of the block. I've pressed them nice and flat. Now it's nice if you have a wool pressing mat, because then it really gets those seams flat. And if you wonder why I don't use steam yet, it's because I don't want to distort anything. There's a lot of bias edges on these blocks, and I don't want anything to mess up that bias edge. So that's why I use dry heat. Okay, so now we're ready to sew the quarter sections together. So again, I'm going to fold one section over the other. Make sure I remember which one's on top. And I'm going to sew from the center. So I'm going to match this center seam right here so that the seams line up. Can you see that? It's hard to see it because of the fabrics. You can't see the fabric, but I've got the seam lined up. And I got to remember if I'm sewing the right seam. Okay, it's this seam I'm sewing. So don't get the seams mixed up. Make sure you're going to sew the right seam. I could sew that seam, but I'm sewing this seam. Match your center so that the seams butt into each other. If there's a little looseness in this piece right here in the section, just add a pin in the center. Again, oops, I'm going the wrong direction. I'm sewing from the bottom up. So I'm going to lay it back down because I don't want to get mixed up here. I'm sewing these two sections together, folding it over, put my finger on the edge I'm going to sew, and I'm sewing from the bottom. Okay, make sure I'm sewing the right side. Correct side, I should say. Okay, so match my center seam. So my centers, match my center seam. Like I said, see there's a little bit of give in there. If you just pull it, since this is a bias edge, you can always tug it just a tiny bit to get it to lay flat. I'm going to put a pin in there. And then again, I'm going to match the tops of my block. This piece needs to be trimmed a little, I think. My square. This needs to be trimmed, or at least the threads trimmed off so I can see it. Okay, I want to match the top of my square and the top of my triangle, and then match this here. Put a pin in there to hold it together. And when I wove in, and then again, I'm going to put a pin right here in the middle. Okay, ready to sew. We're sewing from the center out. Now don't stretch it as you're sewing it, because then you're going to distort the seams again, but just let your machine do the work. Again, when you get towards that top seam, push it a little bit towards your mold foam if you're using foam, or towards your whatever your 1/4 inch guide is. You want to press it so that it you can see that it's going to go cross over the stitching line. I'm going to sew real slow. Check underneath to make sure it's going to sew over. I'm going to open it and check it, and I've got a 1/4 inch seam here. Pretty good, right there. Okay, and everything else checks out okay. And that seam's going to get pressed open. Now the reason I press these seams open is when we go to do the fussy cutting, if you press, like a lot of times you do a star and you press them in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction, but if you press them all open like this, it doesn't distort. where you want everything to match in the center. So it's better to press it open in this one. And it's nothing wrong with pressing it in clockwise or counterclockwise. But for this, I like to press it open. Okay, now I'm going to do the next one. This is the seam I'm going to do. So I'm going to fold it over, put my finger on the seam that I'm going to do, and then sew from the bottom up. Match my center right here. Put a pin in that. Match my seam. And this one I don't have any puffiness in it, but I'm still going to put a pin in there just to hold it together. And again, I'm going to match the top of my square and my triangle. Doesn't make any difference where the other part meets, as long as the triangle and the square are in the same place. Okay, I'm going to match those, fold it down so that I make sure that I'm sewing one right on top of the other to pull it up so it's even with the square. And then I'm going to pin that real good. And then I'm going to put a pin here. Now I'm going to check here and make sure they're still on top of each other, because sometimes that pin, see the pin? When I pinned it, it pushed it away. So I'm going to have to repin that so that they're on top of each other. There we go. Now sometimes if you find that happens, pin it this way to hold that edge together. Just like that. Okay, and when we get there, then I can start taking that pin out. So, ready to sew? Make sure your seams, those center seams, don't flip when you sew the sections together. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm pleased with that. It's not a perfect 1/4 inch, but it is pretty close. And press that seam open. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and press, and I'll be back to show you how to sew the center unit together.